Hi, everyone, and thank you for registering for this Introduction to ArchivesSpace Online Workshop. In advance of this training, you received an email with an agenda for the workshop with links to all of the materials that you will need to participate. These workshop materials included a pre-workshop survey, so thank you for filling that out, a Zoom link and password to join the workshop. You joined it, so you found that link. Please do not share that Zoom link. You will use it to access the workshop today and tomorrow. You also received a test instance of ArchivesSpace for your use. Instructions on how to access the test instance were included. You also received a training workbook for your use during and after the workshop, a Zoom cheat sheet to help you troubleshoot any issues you may have with Zoom, and a getting started document outlining additional ArchivesSpace resources that you may want to take advantage of after this training. Based on our one-day in-person Introduction to ArchivesSpace training, this online training will cover the core concepts and functions of ArchivesSpace. Please remember this is our first attempt at offering a workshop in an online environment, and like you, the trainers are working remotely and under very different circumstances than normal right now. So please understand if elements of the workshop do not go according to plan. This online training will not cover any advanced concepts or explore any plugins or other community-generated enhancements of ArchivesSpace. Unlike our in-person workshop, this online training will not include any live practice exercises, but a shared instance of ArchivesSpace has been provided for your use. We will try to address all attendee questions related to ArchivesSpace, but due to the nature of this workshop, we will not be able to troubleshoot anyone's individual implementation of ArchivesSpace. You will notice that your microphone and camera were muted when you entered the Zoom room. We ask that you keep your microphone and camera muted for the duration of the training. If you would like to ask a question, please type the question into the chat. Questions typed into the chat will be read and answered during allocated time for Q&A. Some questions may be answered directly in the chat in an effort to keep the training on schedule, so keep an eye on the chat for additional information and resources. If you need technical assistance during this workshop, please email us at archivespacehome@lyrasis.org. I will drop that email into the chat. We are using the latest version of ArchivesSpace for this training, which is version 2.7.1. If you are currently using an earlier version of ArchivesSpace, keep in mind some of the features you see today may not be available. Your instructors for this training are Nancy Enneking of the Getty Center and Brittany Newberry of the Atlanta University Center. Nancy will be leading the training today and Brittany will be leading tomorrow. Both trainers and myself will be in attendance both days and are on hand to answer questions and assist as necessary. Before we begin, here's a little info about your trainers. Nancy Enneking is currently the head of institutional records and archives at the Getty Research Institute. She has responsibility for all records management and institutional archives functions for the Getty's 4 operating programs, the Conservation Institute, Foundation, Museum, and Research Institute, and for the overarching trust administration. She has been active on the California Historical Records Advisory Board as a member of the ArchivesSpace User Advisory Council, and since 2014 served as an ArchivesSpace trainer. Prior to her arrival at the Getty in 2004, she spent almost 6 years with the Texas State Archives and worked in several university archives. Brittany Newberry is a processing archivist at the Atlanta University Center. At the AUC, she trains staff, interns, and volunteers on using ArchivesSpace and creates and updates ArchivesSpace manuals. She's an active member of the Society of American Archivists as a member of the Archivists and Archives of Color section and membership committee. She also serves as the Assistant Communications Director for the Society of Georgia Archivists. Brittany is currently the Vice Chair for the ArchivesSpace User Advisory Council and lead for the testing subteam. So with that, I'll turn things over to Nancy to get this workshop started.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on what time zone you're coming from. I hope everyone can hear me. Please let Jessica know if you can't. Just a few notes up front on the overall timing of the agenda. These are sort of general ballpark timelines. I had a chance to look at your survey responses this morning, and so some areas I'm going to speed up a little bit, and others I'm going to slow down to try and cover some of the questions that I noticed there or some of the areas of interest. So what we're not going to cover today are things like events, assessments, OAI, PMH. Frankly, that's a little bit too detailed, since many of the people, as we suspected, in the survey responses indicated that they'd never even seen the system before or had only briefly seen it a long time ago and just needed a general overview of the system as a whole and some of the basic concepts. That's really where we're going to focus today. So I just want to be upfront about that. And let me see, I will try and make a point of right after users and repositories, we're going to try and give a little bit of time for questions, and right after accessions. We are hoping to hit the break at 10:30 my time and 1:30 yours. Yeah, 1:30 yours. And then we'll try and leave some time after resources and around locations. I apologize if we can't get to everyone's questions. But so with that said, let me, especially for the benefit of those who again haven't seen or worked with the system before, I hope everyone can see my cursor because I'm going to wiggle it quite a bit. This is strange for me. I'm usually standing in front of a classroom of people, so I can read body language and I can read facial expressions and see where I'm boring you or where I've lost you and I need to back up. So please, during the course of this, take full advantage of the chat to ask questions, because I can't see in your eyes if I've lost you or not, and I don't want to do that. So if there's something that I need to repeat, something that I need to explain in a different way, I'm happy to do that. But please just let Jessica know, because the screen I see is the screen you're seeing. I'm not seeing the chat go through, so I don't get distracted by it. So Jessica will jump in and let me know if there's anything that I need to back up and go over again. So first off, let's start by going over the main ArchivesSpace screen. For those of you who have never logged in, you would do so up here. If you're following along on your training instance, you would hit this little drop down and you would go to, actually let me log in. This is what you're seeing. And then you would sign in up here in the upper right corner. And you will do admin if you're following along in your instance. Mine is different. Once you log in, this is what you'll see. There are 4 main command areas on the screen. The first one is up here in the upper right. At this point, and we'll get to repositories in a moment, but if you have access to multiple repositories, this is where you would bounce between them. There's some system administration things that you can only do at an administrator level. If you were to log in as a basic user, you would not see most of these features because they're really done across repositories. Manage controlled value lists is where you would manage your drop-down menus. Container profiles are where you would declare sizes of boxes for future space management. I'll be frank, we're not going to be able to cover that today, but this is where you would do it. Location profiles, you would cover how big your shelves are, again, for space management. Manage repositories, you'll see again in a few minutes. So something like this is where we create new repositories if you need one. Manage users, this is where we're going to create users. Again, you can only do that as an administrator in the system. And then access to the help center and some other system administration. Over on this other side of this dropdown are where you can set user and global preferences. Or if you're in here as an administrator, you could become another user, say, for example, one of your staff, to help them so you can see what they see to help them troubleshoot a problem. The second command area is right beneath it, also up here on the right. And this shows the repository that is currently active with the abbreviation. If I were to choose another repository, it would give me a different abbreviation. And that means once this is active, every action you take in here will be as part of this repository. If I create an accession, it will be part of this one. If I create a new resource, it will be part of this. This drop down over here is an important area. These top 2 are where you manage permissions for your users. We'll come to that again very shortly. If we were working on assessments, this is where you could alter some of the assessment attributes. Manage top containers is personally one of my favorite parts of the system. It helps you do bulk things with boxes, like assign multiple boxes to a location, or pull up all of the containers associated with a particular resource or accession. Transfer repository, we won't get in here, and I would strongly suggest that you probably don't do that except as a high-level administrator or repository manager in the system. Background jobs is important. In this area, you're going to, this is where you're going to import records, you're going to export records, well, yeah, you're going to export to PDF, and I'm just going to click on it. And the various jobs are, you can create reports, import data, generate a PDF. Kind of look out for this batch and find and replace. It is beta. I would be a little wary of playing with that. Unless you're in a test instance and you really know your data well. So those are some of the options. I'm going to come back to this drop down. The reports are also found in this area, and plugins. This is where if you want to import a authority record from LCNAF or LCSH, I've just clicked on it. Again, let me show you how I did that. I went down to plugins, clicked on this import, and if I look up a name, corporate body, or if I even enter the NACO number, you have to include the letters in the front of that, I can import a record directly into the system. So that's the second sort of command area. Let me go back to home. The third area is sort of your create, update, delete of the major record types, and that's over here on the left. So you're going to have an option to create each of the core record types from scratch. And your three main descriptive records in the system are accessions, resources, and digital objects. Resources are the finding aids. They're called resources because people do use the system for things other than finding aids. For example, some institutions also use the system to track things like individual theses and dissertations. So it's given a more generic title of resource rather than calling it finding aids. You can also create authority records here, locations, which we'll get to later, and other types of records as you need them. Some of these, again, assessments, classifications, events, we're not really going to be able to cover today. The browse gives you a chance to actually look up all of the existing records that you've already created from within the system. And I'm going to go back here again in a second and actually walk you through the results screens for this. The fourth main command area is the repository-wide search. So whatever, I'm over here on the right now, whatever repository is active, you will search across all of the records in it. That includes digital objects, accessions, locations, anything that comes back as an accurate hit. Now you can simply type something in here, or using this little caret down, there is an advanced search. So you could Boolean, includes or not, by keyword, by title, notes, something like that. And I'm going to say sump, because I know there's some data in here with that name. If I wanted to add a second field, and family, I could, if I wanted to get rid of these, one of them, I changed my mind, I could click on this little delete button over here, the trash can, and that would get rid of the row. But if I conduct the search, clicking on the button, these are my results from within. And again, you can see over here on the left side that it brought back a variety of types of records. So in some cases, it was a personal name. In some cases, an archival object, which would be a component in a finding aid, would be a family, an accession, a resource. You can then click on one of these. I'm going to click on person to filter. And this would then filter that down to just those people. If I click on the X next to the person, I unfilter it. Well, I should. There we go, unfilter it. And then, of course, I can also, these are the related subjects and families. In this case, if you see, I'm going to actually click on filter by archival object. Take it a second. And in this case, you can see that in the search results, there's a found in column. What this means is it's going to take me to, if I were to click on this, which is view or edit, I can view this particular component in the context of this resource by clicking on view. And it will take me to that place in the finding aid. I then go, and this, I will say the browser back button is not always a safe thing to use with systems, but in this case it is, and it actually works pretty well. So if I go back again, I can again look for others. If I want to edit this, I have two choices. I can hit view, and then once it opens, there's an edit button I can hit, or I can simply hit this edit button. The difference between view and edit is that view will show you all of the fields that have been entered and filled out, and only those fields. The edit will show you all the fields that you can fill in, whether or not they've been created. So you'll see a great deal more on the edit, but takes a little longer to read through. So if you just need to see the content, view is a good way to go. The other way you can get back is the breadcrumbs up here along the top. I'm swirling my cursor over them. So here I'm in edit mode. If I want to go back to view mode, I can step back one by clicking on that breadcrumb. I could then also step back again to resources. And in this case, it's bringing up all the resources. So since I'm over here to some degree, so that was the basic search, and then I started navigating away from it a little bit. The other way you can search is to go to Browse and to pick resources, accessions, one of those record types. In this case, the screen didn't change because I was already there, but if I went to accessions, these are all of the accessions in this particular repository. These are all of the resources in this particular repository. At this point, you can still search within, but you're only searching across resources. If you search up here in this command zone, you search across all records in the system. If you're within one of these record types, you're only searching across that particular record type. You then can also filter by a few things, diaries, whether it's a subject, published, level, etc. Okay, so I have my cheat sheet in front of me to make sure I'm covering everything. So let's take a look inside a record itself. I'm going to go to, I'm actually going to create a new resource. I can create from this drop down where I am, but if you are in the browse screen, you can also create over here on the side. Either button will do the same thing. So if I say create resource over here, I'm going to start a new finding aid. So here's what happens when you pull up this record. Again, you have your breadcrumbs. Here's your new resource. It's called new resource because it doesn't have a name yet. There is a sidebar. If you click on various parts of the sidebar, it will take you down to that section of the resource. Once these are filled out, these can be quite long. So rather than scrolling way down, sometimes clicking on the sidebar can save a bit of time and take you directly to something. The way the records work fundamentally is if there is a red asterisk, it is a required field, and you have to fill it in simply to save the record. I mean, literally, the record will not save in the system unless the things with red asterisks are filled in. Now, there are some times, I'm going to look at this date record, where there is a gray asterisk. This is a case of it must have something. So in this case, for a date, it has to have a label, it has to have a type, I'm going to say inclusive, and it has to have some sort of actual date. So you either have to have an expression or you have to have begin and end dates. You can have both, but without them being filled in, one or the other, it won't save. Some other things you can do on this screen, some of these fields are resizable. For example, this title field, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little dash dash over in the corner. You put your cursor on that and drag, it can get bigger and smaller, and you can resize it. You can also, again, many of these have drop-down menus. Many of these are configurable. Up in the top, again, you need sort of administrator high-level access up here under System Managed Controlled Value Lists to edit those. As you get down and look through, we have what we call main records, which is the overall resource digital object accession. And within these, we have sub-records. For example, dates appears all over the place, and this is the structure of a date record. It will look and behave this way, whether it's in a resource record, an accession, or even a personal name. This is how dates are handled pretty consistently. So if you look at the label drop-down, for example, you're going to see entries here that may not make a lot of sense within the context of the overall dates for a finding aid. in this case, creation is probably about right, but agent relation may not make a lot of sense. This date field is also used in the rights module, so copyright is an option. So understand when you see some of these entries that don't seem like they make a lot of sense within the record type that you're working on, it's because this subrecord is used throughout the application. The same thing holds true for extents. It behaves this way consistently throughout the application. So whenever there's an extent option, it's going to be structured in this particular format. In most cases, if a field is repeatable, you can actually add an extent to add a second one. If you decide you don't want to keep it because it was an accident, you could remove the subrecord and it will ask you if you want to confirm removal. You could also add one by clicking on the plus bar at the bottom. You see where I did that? And I'll remove this one. Something else you can do, I'm going to drop down to notes and I'm going to add a note. And I'll come back to this again later this morning, but say a biographical historical note. And you can, if you see this little bit right down here, you can put in additional inline tagging. So you could wrap as part of your text content of a note with additional EAD tags. So for example, can't type. Word should be bold. If I highlight the word, I can wrap it with an env tag. But do notice that it only partially fills in some of these tags. To make this actually correct, once I hit space, it added the render, which it needed to do, but then I actually need to tell it to be bold. Now, if I can save it, now clearly it's supposed to be bold, it's bolds. If I save it mistyped like this, the system will let me do it. And then you need to watch it because you will have validation problems later. So if you are going to do inline tagging, make sure that you and your staff know exactly how to enter those tags, those attributes, and those values, because it will let you save something that's incorrect. Other things, let me see. We did expanding data. Make sure that if you're entering diacritics or other characters that you're using UTF-8, because that's highly problematic if you don't. You're going to have some export problems and some severe validation problems. So make sure it's UTF-8 if you're adding other characters. I showed you one, I think, briefly a second ago, but if you hover over most of these titles, you will see some tooltips that will give you some hints about what should be entered, where this compares to DAX, or in some cases perhaps MARC. These tooltips are configurable in the back end of the system. There's an ENYML file. Probably back on the server side, your server administrators can help you find it. And so you can alter the context of these. If you happen to bring one up and it gets stuck, don't think you can get rid of it, there's this little X in the corner, and that will. One major consideration to think about in working with all of these is that all of these are siloed: accessions, resource, digital objects, subjects, agents. These all exist in their own silos within the system. And each of these silos links to the other, but it's only a relationship link. So for example, if I want to associate a personal name or a corporate body in the agents with a particular resource, I can link them together, but that doesn't alter either record. So linking them has no impact on the content of the finding aid. It also has no impact on the content of the actual personal name record, but you will see a list and shows what's tied to what. If you were to delete that link, it does not delete either record on either side. All it does is break the relationship between them. The idea is that you could have one name, for example, that's used multiple times throughout the system, or one resource that's linked to multiple names. which are also used in other places around the system. So they're intended to be siloed, and just watch the linking. Again, breaking a link will not delete anything, just the relationship. I hope that makes sense. Usually I'd be looking around the room like, does that make sense? And trying to make eye contact, but yeah, we can't do that. So that's the basic, I think, overview. Let me show you very briefly. We're not going to have time to talk about it, but there is a PUI. I'm going to go back over here to home quickly. I'm going to leave the screen and not save it. View public interface, I'm down here. And since I'm logged in, it's going to take me over. This is what the public interface looks like. We do have some things that are public in here right now, so some repositories. And these have collections within them. I look at collections, it shows all of the collections that are public across all of the repositories. And I'm just going to pull one up. Pull up this one. If you open, for example, a finding aid in here, you have an overall collection overview with some hierarchy over here on the right, which you can drill down and go to that particular place. The collection organization here in the middle actually gives you this entire thing, including the organization and this overview as one long string on the page. Container inventory can be interesting for some folks, especially if you are doing a intellectually arranged finding aid as opposed to some boxes in physical order. So if you have box 1 that's scattered, used and scattered across an entire finding aid because it's not in physical order, you can use this to click on it and see everything that's actually contained in that box. So if a researcher requests it, they'll know everything that's in the box, regardless of where it may appear in the finding aid. And that was, browser back. So this is a finding aid. Unprocessed material is accessions. Not everyone wants their accessions public. Some places have to make their accessions public, depending on what your public record laws are. But this would bring up the accessions, and you could see whatever was in there, depending on what's been made public and sent to the public interface. You could go to names and if you click on the name, it will show you in what collections that name is used. So you could have a list of 20 or 40 or 1. Digital materials. These are digital objects, and you click on it, should be able to open it up. So that's that. Again, I wish I could go into more detail. There's actually quite a bit of detail in the workbook I believe you were all sent. So please do take a look at that. But I'm going to head back. I'm down here. Actually, a quick way to get back to the staff interface. You can see my cursor wiggling is down here, staff interface. Since I'm already logged in over there, if I click on it, it takes me right back. So that's a basic overview of how the application works. I will say that on page 16 of your workbook, remember when I was talking about linking the various record types in the system to each other, there's a list on page 16 that shows all the records that can link to each other, in case that's helpful to see. So let's
Hi, Nancy, this is Christine. Someone in the chat has a question about diacritics. Could you just talk a little bit about how diacritics work in ArchivesSpace and how you can get them in there?
What we do is we'll go to something like Word and do like grab something from the character set to make sure that it's UTF-8 compliant, and then paste that character in. So that's the big trick, is making sure that whatever character you're using in there is UTF-8 compliant. We do sometimes have issues with ampersands as well, so you need the code, which I think is ampersand AMP semicolon, something like that. And so sometimes you'll need to do that, or you'll have some XML validation problems on the outside. Does that help answer? But I think I need to like set up my screen sharing differently. But I think if you, I'm opening Word here in the back end, if I go to insert and symbol or character, yeah, I think it's symbol, you should be able to get them there. Does that help?
I think so.
Okay. Okay, let me jump into repositories. Now this, yep.
Before you do that, is there any way you could like Control plus your screen to make it a touch bigger?
Yes.
That may help. That's good.
Is better?
Yeah. Oh, that's nice.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for the heads up. Okay, so normally we sometimes when teaching it, we handle this a little bit later in the workshop, but let's talk about resources, repositories and users. Because we know, I think there are some people who, given that we're all working from home right now, kind of want to get up and going in the system. So we wanted to introduce this to you as quickly as possible in case you needed it in order to get set up and play. So as I mentioned before, you can select a repository. What repositories are ways for multiple archival departments or institutions to share a single implementation of ArchivesSpace. The way it's set up is that the digital objects, the accessions, and the resources, for example, are unique to each repository, but the repositories would share agents and subjects between them. And there's some other things that share, but that's most of it. So the idea would be, for example, where I am, we have two different archival repositories at the Getty. We have a special collections repository, and we have an institutional records and archives repository. So we both share ArchivesSpace. We all talk to each other when we want to do system-wide things with it, but a lot of the institutional records are fairly confidential, and sometimes when new things come into special collections, they can be confidential. So we don't have the ability to dive into each other's core records unless we're given permissions to do that as specific users. And I'll show you how that's possible in a second. So in order, when you implement ArchivesSpace, as a part of the implementation, you're automatically set up with one repository. But you might need to make a second one. One might be perfectly fine. Actually, I should say that we also have an intern repository, so that when we have graduate interns or just interns coming in from a class down at UCLA or something, and they don't have a lot of archival experience, we don't always necessarily want to throw them directly into our main repositories. So we set up a smaller repository that allows them to do their work without worrying about any accidental oopses. And then when they're done, we transfer those resources into the main repository. So that's also done. So if you wanted to create a new repository, you come over to System, over here, and do the drop down to Manage Repositories. Now these are the three that are currently in the system. You can see the one that's selected, and you can choose to select the other two. Now you need to be in here as an administrator to do this. So I'm going to create a new repository. And these are the fields you'll see where I'm sorry for those who are interested, we're just not going to have time to cover OAI. But note that is it disabled? It's like yes or no. So by default, it kind of is enabled, I think. So contact details. So the only things that you have to have in order to save this record are a repository. So I'm going to say my and MNR as the abbreviation. This abbreviation is what's going to show up here. Again, this repeat abbreviation shows up here. The publish box determines whether or not anything associated with this repository will go to the public interface. If this is not checked, you won't see any of your repository information in the public interface. I know I showed it very briefly, but there was that repository was the first link, and it won't show up if that's not clicked. The organization agency code, I'm just going to fill in mine. And you can tell from the tooltip, this is meant to be the ISO compliant standard identifiers for libraries and related organizations. And for the US, this would include the MARC organization code list. So this isn't a code that you would make up. You would go to one of these places and find the code that's important for your repository. This will export because you can export resources as MARC XML. This will appear as your organization agency code in that. You could also enter your parent institution. It's do this. University, and you might be in it. And this is a feature I didn't mention earlier. There's a type ahead in most of these drop downs. So if I start typing United States, it will start limiting a very long ISO list of countries, and I can just select the one that I want. I could enter a homepage URL, a branding URL, and I'm going to skip down, and I'm going to add contact information. Now, this information from repositories, when you export the XML of a finding aid or print it to PDF, depending on your style sheet, this information will come out. So in a sense, you're putting in detail here that will show up in all of your resources when you export them. And that said, it's going to be public. So you probably don't want to put your personal contact information here. You probably want to put the contact information for your reference desk, your phone reference, your reference email account, whatever it is that you want the public to contact, that's what I would put in here. I hope that makes sense. I can then save the repository, or if I need to make multiple repositories at once, I could save it and hit +1. If I do that and hit the +1, it will save the repository I was working on and open up a new record. In this case, I don't actually want a new record, so I'm just going to use my breadcrumbs to go back to repositories, and now I can see this new one. And I wanted to publish it and didn't click it, so I'm going to go into Edit and hit Publish, and I'm going to save it. At this point, I could delete this repository if I want to. So now I have my repository. And I hope all of that makes sense. Again, the important part is make sure that watch that contact information so you're not putting your direct line, phone number line out to the public unless you really want to. So now I have a repository, but I need to make some users. So what I want to do is to have a valid user within the system. And in your workbook manual, this is going to be starting about page 136. To be a functional user, you have to have two things. You have to have a core user record, and that core user has to be assigned permissions in a repository. It could be assigned permissions in multiple repositories. For example, I might be a viewer in the special collections because I'm a department head and they trust me. I might be a viewer in the special collections repository and the manager of my own repository. My former boss wanted to go in and look at both repositories, but he didn't trust himself to enter data in the system, so he was a viewer in both repositories. So I'm going to show you how to set up something like that. So the first thing that we are going to do is that we're going to create a user, and I'm up here again at System. Actually, let me go back to Home just so this screen isn't confusing. So I'm up here. I'm going to go up here to System, and again, you have to be an administrator to create a user. Because you can assign that user to multiple repositories, administrators are the only category of permissions in the system that allow you to work with multiple repositories at a time at that high of a level. So you have to be an administrator. And I'm going to come down here to Manage Users. If I click on it, I can see all of the users who are in the system. And I'm going to create a new one. And this is the one place in the system where you do this. As I create the system, the record, you can see that there are two fields. There are two, really three. username, full name, and password that are required fields. So I'm going to say that this is and this can be LDAPed. So you can, if you work with your server and technical administrators, you could set this up to use a standard network login. But in this case, we're just going to create the record. You can enter as much information as you want to. And I'm going to enter a password. And notice that even I, as an administrator, cannot see what that password is. If you're not LDAPed and you're just using passwords in the system, if you forget your password, your boss or whomever can't get it back from you. You'll have to reset it. So this is enough to save the account, as John Doe. Notice this little box down here at the bottom, Grant System Administrator Permissions. This is the only place in the system where you give yourself a system administrator status in the staff interface. This is not server-side administration, it's the system administration. So this, if I click this, John Doe is going to be able to have full access to all the repositories and all records in them. I actually, where I work, I have 2 accounts for myself. I have one for myself as my repository manager as an everyday user, but because I'm one of the Getty sponsors for ArchivesSpace, I'm fairly well trusted in the system, I have another account that has system administrator permissions. And I use that account when I'm intentionally going in to do things that are multi-repository based. And again, I'm talking with my colleagues before I do this. But so depending on what I need to do in the system, I determine which account I'm going to log in to use. I'm not going to make him a system administrator. And I just forgot what that password is, so I'm going to change it. Okay. This, I'm going to create the account. I thought I did that. I'm not using my usual keyboard, so I'm, there we go. Okay, now at this point, I could log in as John Doe, and I can't do a thing because I haven't assigned him to a bucket of permissions. Even though this repository is active, nothing that I've done has assigned him to it. Now, if I want to assign him to particular permissions within here, I would come over to this gearbox dropdown, and it says Manage Groups and Manage User Access. I'm going to look at Manage Groups first. And checking my time here. So the first thing we're going to do is, in this case, may not be the best example, because this has already been messed with a little bit. By default, there are normally 6 user groups. I'm going to click over actually to a different repository, MNR, one I just made. And these are the default user groups. 6 come. They can be edited. They can be deleted. You can create additional groups. If I were to go in and look at the managers of this repository, I can edit it. And I can see all of these are the lists of permissions that can be assigned. And as a manager, let's say I want to be able to do all of these things. And I will say that doing all of these things is still not as powerful as being a system administrator. I want to change this. And I've now clicked on all of them. And I want to say, I'm going to leave. I could edit this description if I want to, and I can do John Doe. I actually have to click on the blue and add it. And then if I save this, John Doe is now a manager of this repository. I could flip over and back to my YNHSC. and come back to the gearbox. And in this repository, I could manage groups. And I could say viewer is down here at the bottom. I'm going to edit that. And I'm going to add the core user records live independently, again, of the repository. So I can add them to any. So I'm going to add John Doe. And in this case, the only thing that this particular user group can do is view the records in the repository, and that's it. No editing, no nothing. I'm going to save the group. If I have edited all of these groups and I have them chunked out the way I want them to, I can actually, the other option I have for assigning a user would be just manage user access. And all that does is just say, take John Doe, edit groups, and I could add them to additional groups. I will say that if whenever you upgrade the system to the next version, do go in and double check the permission settings. Sometimes new ones appear. So just, especially if you haven't upgraded, if you haven't, we're on 1.5.2, I think, at home. And when we move to the current version, I'll go in and we're on 2.5.1. When we move to 2.7, whatever that version is, I'll go in and double check all the permissions to make sure that nothing has changed and that I don't need to restructure my permission groups. So that's how you create a user and assign them permissions in the system. If I were to, let me show you very quickly, if I were to go in and log out and sign in as John Doe, and there we go. So now I'm logged in as him. Even you notice if you start clicking around, he has access to 2 repositories, and he was the manager of this one. And he can see a few things here, but still not as many as he could. And remember, we clicked on everything to give him all the permissions in that manager section. You still can't see as much as you can when you're logged in as administrator. If I were to switch him to the other one in which he was a viewer, yeah, I'm not sure you should be able to do that. Anyway, anyway, yeah, that's interesting. You go double check that. Perils of live demos, I guess. So anyway, he can't see as much as he could before. And there are, to browse, and notice the edit button is gone because he should just be a viewer in this repository. So he shouldn't be able to edit anything, but he should be able to look at it. So let me log out and log back in as me. And let's go talk about actually creating our first core descriptive record, which is accessions. Although actually, let me stop. Are there, Emma, taking a little bit longer than I had hoped, but are there any questions at this point about repositories and users?
Nancy, we do have one question about repositories and users. And if you do have any other questions, please type them into the chat right now. Brittany did answer this in the chat, but it's worth asking. Does the user list sort by name?
As far as I can tell, it sorts by the most recently created.
Right, right.
So, so the order of creation, it would be nice to be able to sort them alphabetically, but it doesn't. If it did, it would be up here and you would click on this bar. And that's typically, so for example, if you were going to sort by something, and this is something I should have pointed out earlier, if I'm bringing up all the resources, I could, on this one, see how the cursor changes. If I'm in resources, I can click on title and it will reorient them. I could also, while I was in here, choose a couple other things to sort by. Created and modified. But since in users, it wasn't really a live sort, so you're stuck with the order of creation. Any other questions before I move on to accessions?
One more just came through. Can users belong to more than one group?
Yes. So you can, so they can be in more than one group. In some places, for example, I think it was Yale, I could be wrong about that. actually divided up all of their permission groupings into functional areas, and as opposed to status sort of within the department. So they made like a user group for someone who would be doing, I guess, data creation, but not necessarily authority work. So they might have one user group that's focused on authority work, one user group that's focused on, say, resource creation, and then they could give their staff access to one or more of those. So some of these are set up, again, by hierarchy in the department, but you could completely restructure them to do it by functional area, and then assign as many groups as you need. Does that help? And again, that could be true across multiple repositories at one time. You could have a user that is and does all the authority work in, say you have 3 repositories, and you set your permission groups up to say, you know, these are the authority related permissions, and give the same person that authority bundle in each repository. So only one person is doing the authority work across all the repositories, if you needed to do that.
Andrea says, yes, thank you, that helps.
Okay, so let me go ahead and move on to accessions. I'm sorry if there are more questions, but I want to keep us on track so we get to your break at 10:15. And accessions are important. So there are a number in the system. I'm going to pull one up. I'm going to pull it up in view mode. Again, how did I get here? Let me go back to home and I'll show you. I went to browse. I went to accessions. And that just brought up all the existing ones. And I'm just going to look at this particular stump family record that's already created. And I'm going to view it. This is just to show you where we're going with this. I follow my dog. Sorry, it's trash day. If you hear the dog barking, I apologize. I'm locked out of the room, as are the cats, but and perils of live webinars. So this is an existing accession record in the system, and I'm again in view mode, so I'm only seeing the fields that have been filled in. And I have a title, I've got an identifier, I've got the date that it was accessioned, content description, condition description, provenance, whether or not there are restrictions, dates and extents, and if I look at the drill down, it gives me a little bit more information on the dates. Same thing with the extents. Now, we also have some linked agents, some family names and some individuals. We're not actually going to cover this right now. We're going to cover agents and subjects and how they link into these records more tomorrow with Brittany. So I'm not going to cover it here. I just want to show an example of what it looks like when it's all done. The idea with these workshops and webinars is that we slowly build the concepts over the course of the entire thing. So we don't get people too overwhelmed at once. In this particular case, this particular accession record has a deaccession. So there's a record of that, the deaccession date that again works the same way as every other date in the system. And in this case, some assessments were done of this particular accession and what would be needed. Again, I'm sorry, assessments we cannot cover today, though there is an entire other little multi-hour training on assessments. Same thing with, I'm sorry, I went really fast there with rights. There's another sort of half-day training that we have just on the rights module. And it's not something I'm going to have time to cover today because it is unfortunately too complex for the basics workshop. And I apologize for that. But we're packed enough as it is. So if we come back over to accessions, let's build one from scratch. And I'm gonna just I did that too fast again. Let me go to home, browse, accessions, or I could do it from create accession. That would also, again, just, let me do that. I'm in here, create accession. It's gonna open a brand new accession record. And you'll see there are a lot more fields here than were necessarily filled in our prior accession record. Now, what is the point of an accession record? It's fundamentally to get some administrative control over materials entering your archive. This is often unprocessed material, and it may stay that way for decades. I mean, let's face it. And so this might be your fundamental descriptive access point for quite some time. You might also have rules that are set by your general counsel or others saying you must have this kind of information. You may want to repurpose and it needs to be documented someplace, you may want to repurpose this and use one of the reports to print out an accession receipt to give to your donor, so that you each have a copy of here's exactly what you gave us and when and how much stuff it was. So this is what the accession record can be used for. Now I want to say, starting here, and this is true for every part of the ArchivesSpace system, you as a repository really need to think through your purpose and intent in filling out these fields. Just because there's a field here doesn't mean that you have to put information in it if it doesn't suit your purpose. I am a big believer in that each repository should have its own manual of practice, so to speak, not a manual that tells you how to use ArchivesSpace itself. That's what the help is for, which, by the way, the help is over here. And would click you over to the, I'm not logged in here right now, but that would take you over to help if you click on these little help buttons over to the wiki help. And lost my train of thought there. But you should have a manual that says, here's how we as a repository, I'm sorry.
Sorry, while you're catching your train of thought, if you could just really quickly clarify the difference between an accession record and a resource record.
An accession record would be a brief record, basically that would be your documentation that this material has come into your archive and that you now own it. The resource record is where the finding aid would be, which would be the detailed inventory of that material. And it might be, a finding aid might be made up of multiple accessions. In fact, very shortly, I'm going to show you how that might work. So an accession record is just for a chunk of stuff that comes into your archive on a given day, for example, and that you're just proving, okay, we have this now, it's documented, here's a brief description of it, here's maybe where we put it in stacks. Multiple accessions might later become a resource, which would be the detailed EAD XML that you would generate, do thorough description of, and then possibly share with whether it's ArchivesGrid or other consortial things, or put on your website. Again, depending on public access laws, your accessions you might consider public. You might not consider public, unless like state archives or something, they may have to be public for the most part to demonstrate that you have it. But it should be a much more abbreviated record. And I will say, if you notice, I'm going to bounce out of this for 1 second and just go into, you can work with view or edit. So I've just pulled up an existing accession record, and notice these buttons up here in this toolbar. You can view, published, add event, spawn. We'll get to that in a second. Transfer or more. What there isn't here is an export button. If we're in resources, there will be an export button, and you can export it as EAD XML, or you could then also go over and export it as a PDF. Part of the reason there's no export button here is, what would you export it as? If you stop and think about it, there is no archival standard for an accession record. There's nothing like DAX. There's not an XML like EAD structure for accession records. Every repository should have accession records, but it's usually repository specific. So that's not why there's not really an export up here. Now you could have a MARC record for an accession record, but these fields don't necessarily map to MARC. They were simply created here because there's a sort of an accepted practice of creating accession records and some of the fields that might go in them, even if they vary from repository to repository. But right now, there's not an export. So if you want to get this information out, you can either look at it in the PUI, or you could use one of the reports that you would find in the background jobs to export an accession record as a PDF or JSON or something like that. So that was a long answer to your question on what's the difference between the two. Did I answer that question before I sort of went off on a tangent about exporting?
No additional questions have popped into the chat, so let's assume it made sense.
Sorry, it's easier to go on tangents when you're just talking to your computer screen. So let's go back and create our new one. And there is only one required field for an accession record. That's the identifier. And so I'm going to say, and I'm going to make an accession. This is today's date. I'm going to say it's today. It could have been, you know, last week. You could change that. This is the date that we actually got the material in. And I'm going to say, this is an identifier. It can be multi-part. The system will provide punctuation between these elements in different places. And so this is going to be 2020. And let's say this is the 50th accession I've gotten this year. You can do this. I think the first field can be 255 characters, and I think the others are a little bit shorter, but it can accommodate a fairly complex identifier. So whatever you have, I could put all in one field if that's what I wanted to do. But because for my own, I do a lot of custom reports in the background, and I like to be able to parse things out by different data fields. So for myself, I would probably do something like this so I could more easily pull up all of my 2020 accessions without having to do some sort of little script to parse it out from a string in the first field. Now at this point, I can save the accession record, and that's all the system requires in order to save it, which of course is really not helpful because you can look it up by that number, but most of us would prefer to have a title of some point. That's a lot easier to find things with. So I'm going to go ahead and enter one, and I'm going to make some, say my Jane Doe. Trustee minutes, and I'm going to say that at a certain point, just in the interest of time, I will stop correcting my bad typing. I apologize for that. And I would have a nice little summary maybe of exactly what's in the minutes, what kind of their major topics, whatever little bit that I know. I might say that older material has some tears. Condition description. Otherwise. And each repository would have to decide what good is. You might, if you had a little manual on accessioning, you might have a little note in there that says this is what we're going to put in the condition description depending on what the state of the material is. And I could say that there should be a, in my case, maybe there's a retention rule. I could say notice none of these are required. If I save the accession at this point, once the record is saved, now I have all of these elements up here. So I could spawn it as something else. I'm actually going to show you that with a different record in a second. I could then come down. I could say, yeah, I want to publish it, or maybe no, I don't. Maybe some restrictions apply. I could say these are highly confidential. And the general counsel, apologize for the typing. I could add dates. Once I add a date, if I were to try and save it with this open, without filling in the information, I could hit save. Now, once I started entering changes, I had the option to revert changes. So if I make mistakes, I could revert those changes. It would go back to the record as I last opened it. Once I hit save, that starts all over. So I can't revert a change after I've saved the record, only up until I've changed the record. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And in this case, it's complaining. It wouldn't save it because it thought something was missing. If I hit the little caret, it will take me down to where it thinks the problem is. And in this case, it was a date field that I hadn't fully completed. So I'm going to say these are inclusive. I'm going to say that these are 1900 to 2000. And we have that filled. Same thing with extent. Once it's opened, you either need to get rid of the record or complete the required fields. In this case, I'm going to say portion is whole. I'm going to say that I've got 25 feet of this material. This type should be the volume, not a count necessarily, if that makes sense. So it's a little, actually, I'm about to show you a place where it can be a count. So it's a little, come on, go away. There we go. So in this case, I'm going to say it's 25 linear feet as the whole of the material that I got. I could add, for example, another extent. And I could say part. And I could say, and here's where I'm going back on what I just said a second ago, I'm going to say there are 250 photographic prints. And so I could break it out this way. I could say the whole collection is of this much volume. And I could break out sub-portions if I needed, if I needed to document that. This is very much a case of garbage in, garbage out. If I really care to track photographic prints across all my collection, that only really helps me if I do it consistently. And if I want to pull custom reports out, photographic print should be a pretty consistent type. I don't want to use, I want to pick something, not necessarily alternate between singular and plural, so to speak, because then I've got to pull more things for some sort of custom report if I want to generate some counts out of this. If I did want to count, for example, the number of boxes for this overall whole, I might say something like 40. Again, this is more of a volume for the whole. And this is more of a count. But just be careful how you use this. It can be really helpful, but consistency is going to be key. And as with any of these fields, if you don't have a purpose for it, don't fill it in. Some of this, when we show you spawning in a second, some of this will go over to a resource record, but inventory, for example, does not. So anything you fill in inventory will stay in its accession record, and you can't spawn it to a resource to start completing your inventory. If you were to have a Word document, for example, that came over with it that gave you an inventory list, you could use external documents. And in this case, the location is pointing to the location of a file. So you might say inventory, because you haven't started creating a finding aid yet. And this might be your address for where that file lives. If I save this, I now have over on the side, you can see I have two extents. I have a date, I have an external document, I've got some core information. If I look at it here, this is the information I've filled in view mode. Now, one thing I want to point out before we jump away, and I've got just a few minutes, is this spawn. We're going to do resource after our break, but I want to show you accession and why you might want to do that. So I'm going to say I have another one already kind of filled out, and I'm going to say Jane Doe University trustee background. I made this this morning. So I'm going to view it. And these are, again, records that come over periodically. Let's say these background files on trustees, they come over, they're created by the Office of the President. When somebody leaves, they come over usually in a chunk or something like that. And in this case, when they do come over, they're fundamentally exactly the same types of material. And most of the information that I've put on here holds true for them. So what I might want to do is, and in this case here I have an inventory of that particular accession and I've got it saved over there. I might want to spawn this accession to another accession. What that will do is duplicate this content so I don't have to rekey most of it. I will need to edit it because, for example, the identifier is going to be different. It's going to be a different, it came in 5-10 years later, so it might be different, but other fundamentals might be the same. So what I did there, I did that a little fast. Let me get out of it without saving and do it again. This time I'll browse down and find it. It's down here. I can do this from view mode or edit mode. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to hit spawn. I'm going to hit accession. And once the accession is here, it's telling me that it's been spawned. It is now a brand new record. I cannot, if I edit the former accession, my original Jane Doe University trustee background files, if I edit that, that will not update anything here. And notice that it cleaned out the identifier field. So I'm going to do YNHSC 2020, and this is 051. And my accession date is actually going to be it's going to be April, and say it came in last week. And this is all the same by the name of the trustees and materials. Maybe they found some additional ones, so they're catching us up. I'm editing this. I might edit the dates. What did I say? Forgot what I said. 2000. And the extent might just be 10 feet, and it's in 10 banker's boxes or record storage boxes, however you want to. Something like that. And that might be, also notice external documents was cleared out because it was assuming that that maybe wasn't something that should go over. But in this case, when I save it, it's now saved all of that. In the past, and this might be something new with this release, it used to automatically create a related accession. But in this case, I'm going to go in and I'm going to say this is a sibling, and I'm going to search for the other and notice as I start typing ahead, it's going to start filtering for whatever it can find. And it knows that's the other one. And so I can say this is related to this particular accession. And once I say it's related here, if I go back to accessions down at the bottom, I can also see that it created a related accession to the other one. So once I made that relationship on one side, it tied it to both. But again, I could break this link. This is a link. I could break it, and both records would still be standalone. And I am right, I think, at 10:15, and I've not really done a great job You all can go on break, but because I ran up right against time, I'm happy to stay for 5 minutes and answer questions. And then I'll go get a drink of water.
We don't have any questions related to accessions in the chat yet, but please feel free to go ahead and type them in. I will say we were getting some questions in the chat about using the test instance that was provided. Please feel free, if you would like to try along as Nancy's working, you can make use of that test instance. It is not the same as the one Nancy is using, so you're not going to overwrite any of the work that she's doing. Oh, we did just get a question. When do we restart? We're going to restart at 1:30 Eastern. So in 15 minutes. So go ahead. If you need to step away for 15 minutes, please feel free. Will we cover spawning accessions to resources after the break? That we just did spawn an accession to resource. Nancy, if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Well, we spawned an accession to another accession, but we will definitely spawn a resource, an accession to a resource after the break.
Sorry, doing too many things at once. Yeah, we'll do that part after the break. Sorry. But yeah, please feel free to go ahead and use the test instance as you want. That will stay available at least through the end of this week. And the workbook is yours to download and use. There are some additional exercises in the workbook that you can use to practice as well. Plus, of course, additional information about everything that we're covering. Since we haven't gotten any other questions in the chat, we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and we will come back at 1:30 Eastern. All right, everyone, it is 1:30 Eastern, so we'll go ahead and get started again. Nancy, I think that you will answer this in the process of going over resource records, but we did get one question asking, do folders count as resource records? So just keep that in mind as you are telling us what a resource record is.
Yeah, we will cover that. I hope, but if I don't clarify that, please do ask me any follow-up questions that will help me clarify it for you. So we're going to start with resources, and this is where we're going to spend a great deal, like the next hour and some. So where we're going to start, what I want to start with actually is showing you an existing resource record to show you where we're going with all of this. Be slightly complex up front. It's not really once you get the hang of it, but until you're used to it, it'll seem a little complex. But here's the Krispy Kreme Corporation records. And this is a real finding aid that Mark Custer found and that we put in here. And so I'm going to open that up in view. Now, again, just to remind you where I am and how I got here. Let's say I'm back here at home. I went to Browse and then Resources. And I could either filter for it or I could scroll down and find it. I'm going to go ahead and open it in view mode. So this is basically a finding aid. And we're going to be discussing how we get all of this data into the system. This finding aid has hierarchy. It is organized into series. So if I drill down to, let's say, administrative records, it has series and sub-series. If I click on administrative records, it will open that part of the record and take me here. And here you can see a level of description is series. Doesn't have a lot more information. It's just giving you overall structure and hierarchy. I could drill down a little further into correspondence. And again, this is a sub-series. Once I click on it, you can see it down here in level of description. And then I start getting down into files. And what this level of description file is in the, let me back up, in the same way that this is the overall collection, and then we have a series and a sub-series. These are all intellectual organizational sets, so to speak. We're not talking about physicality, we're talking about intellectual organization. In the same way, this level of description file, or if we had one item, we're not talking about physical things yet. We're talking about intellectual. So this particular set of correspondence could be, in this case, it's a box and folder, but this particular set of correspondence could be huge. It could be 10 bankers boxes, but it's all 1930s correspondence. And then in the physical part of it, we would say we had boxes 1 through 10, or folders, whatever. So file does not necessarily, in this context, as level of description is not the same thing as a physical folder. File here is more of an intellectual construct. If our level of description were item, that item might be a 500-page report with attachments that takes up 4 Hollinger boxes. And the 4 Hollinger boxes would be what would be described over here. So I know it's a little bit of a stretch. It makes a bit more sense once you've been through the system a bit more, but keep in mind this level of description is intellectual. So we will get to the physical, believe me. So as I drill down, depending on what your own institutional practice is, some of these series or sub-series might have notes. They might have more description. Let me go find, I'm going to actually pick one in a different repository that I know to show you another example of where we're going. Just bear with me. And we'll do, I'm picking this one because I know it. So here's another one, and this is one that it's actually a real finding aid from my own repository. And we require, say when we are doing a series or sub-series description, we require notes at series and sub-series level. And we require a scope and content note and an arrangement statement at least. We could also require restrictions on access notes if that were appropriate, or something else. So again, how you create the finding aid, how many notes you choose to use, how you drill down. A lot of this is based on DAX, but it's also going to be repository specific and even collection specific, depending on how much description that collection needs in order for someone to decide whether or not they should buy an airplane ticket to come and look at it. So let's go and talk about how we actually get all of this hierarchy and all of this detail and this physicality into these records. So I'm going to do 2 things. First, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back into my YNHSC repository. And I'm going to create a resource from scratch. I'm going to do this so we can run through the fields that are required. And then once we just do a basic record to show what's required, I'm going to go and spawn something from an accession record. So I've created a new resource. And again, I went over here to create, just hit the drop down and hit resource. And this is the beginning of a new finding aid. Notice you don't see all of that hierarchy that I was drilling through before up here because we haven't even saved anything yet. And notice there are a bunch of fields with red asterisks in them. So these are all required before you can even save the record. Now, this is in order to maintain compliance with DAX because the DAX requires these things for something to be a DAX compliant record. Now, in practice, and as we get to this, I'll freely admit that you may not know all of this information. So this might be whatever your identifier for your finding aid is. Level of description, I'm going to say collection. And again, this is that drop-down list. And these are the archival levels of description. See DAX Chapter 1. And these are prescribed. This is not a customizable list. They're prescribed by EAD. And again, these are intellectual hierarchy, reflect intellectual hierarchy. I'm just going to call this a collection. Language is required by DAX, and this is fairly new within the last release or so. So in this case, you can either add a language note. Well, you can actually do both. You can add languages, you can add a language note. So one way you could do it would be to say, if you had, let's say, and this is the language of the material in the collection, not the language of the finding aid itself. This is the language of the material in the collection. So let's say it might just be English. I can start typing ahead, go to English, and I could say Latin. I could add another language. Let's say there's also something in Spanish. And So I could enter them as a string. I could also do the following. I'm going to remove these. I could do something like, I could say multiple. And I could add a note. Language of materials. That would say, there are different repository practices in this regard, so you'll want to decide how you want to do that. If I wanted to say something other than language of materials, this will come out in EAD as the label for this field. If I wanted it to say records or something, if I wanted to say anything else, I would type it in the label, and the label would then come out as the title of the field in my finding aid and in my XML. So I'm just going to keep going at this point and find more. Now, dates are also required by DAX. Now, let's say I'm just starting to process this, so I probably don't know what the real date range is because I haven't been through everything in detail yet. Simply in order to get the record to save, you have to put something in. So at this point, I would just rough out something. If you know the ballpark might be 1950 to 1980. You could say inclusive and just leave it at that for now and know you have to go back later. You could even say, actually, let me do this. And let's say if I had bulk dates, I could say, you can have multiple dates, as many as you need, really. 1977, and that would be bulk. And I could do the beginning and end. I'm not going to bother with begin and end right now because I know I'm going to have to go back and probably edit these later. Same thing with extent. It's required by DAX, so the system is forcing you to save it, to enter something before you can save the record. And again, let's just say this is 15 linear feet. And again, you'll have to go back later and update this. The other two required fields before you can save the record are down here in this finding a data section, and I'm going to come back to the section again later, but first I'm just going to save the record. And we're going to go to language of description, and this is the language of the finding aid itself. In this case, my finding aid is in English, so I'm going to just type that in, and it does, this time it definitely requires the Latin. And at this point, I can now at least save the stub record. Now that I've saved it, I see all sorts of other options here. I can enable rapid data entry. I can add a child, which is how in a second we're going to start building out our hierarchy and our other content. This load via spreadsheet is actually the Harvard import plugin. It's about to become core code. I wish I had time to demonstrate it for you today. I think Jessica is going to put in the chat a link over to the GitHub. The idea is that they have a spreadsheet. If you fill that in the right way and they have a template for you, you can actually load a bunch of hierarchy and content just using the spreadsheet without having to use the internal workings of the staff interface. And it's very handy. Yeah, I don't have time today, but we will put something in the chat for you for that. Other things that now show up are you can add an event. You can publish all of it to the public user interface. You could also publish it by clicking on this checkbox down here. You could export this as EAD, mark XML, or generate a PDF. You could merge it with another finding aid. And you could, if some of this were enabled, calculate dates and extents or create an assessment. And I wish we had time to cover all of this today, but you see there's already enough. So now that I've started this, I'm going to go back down to finding a data because this is one part you'll want to pay attention to. EAD ID, this can be a required field in order for proper validation. So we use, where I live, we use something like combination of United States. I can't remember. Might be. I can't remember if it's 1 colon or 2. Bear with me. And then our finding aid number. Something like that. And there are, I think in the manual and in the help, there's more detail on all of these. One thing to pay attention to is this is the title of the finding aid itself is going to go here. So it might be the very special. Special records. And the finding aid of the very special records of finding aid filing title is how you want this to sort, particularly if you're sharing it with an aggregator. For example, Archives Grid, or in the case of California, the Online Archives of California, in which case it might be something like I really can't type, and I apologize for that, but you get the idea. If it were university records, it would be however you want that to sort. Description rules, most likely going to be DAX these days. It could be something else. It could be ISAD-G. But whatever your description rules are, that's where it should go. You can fill these in as you need to. Finding aid status might be in progress. If this was a previously written finding aid, it might be in the process of being revised, and you can put in the date. And it might be I could also add a bunch of notes if I wanted to do a lot of description of this particular set of material. So to add notes, and these would be your scope content notes, your biographical historical notes, your arrangement statements, all of these. There are 29 possible notes that can be added, and those are based on EAD. All of this is based on EAD. Okay, not user-defined fields, I'll take that back. But for the core, and when this comes out, it's going to be tagged accordingly. So for example, let's say I want to add a biographical historical note, and I want to say this is the type. I want to say, let's say when I want this to print, I want it to say administrative history. And I could type a development of something. I could add a second note, and I could do the same thing, biographical historical note, and this time I could say I want it to be a sketch and then the history of the donor. If I save it, I can see over here I have 2 notes. I don't know if you can see, there are 3 little parallel bars here. If I grab that, I can change the order of these notes. There's another way to do that as well. And depending on your style sheet, they'll either come out in the order you tell it to on this screen, or your style sheet will put it in some predetermined order when you generate the PDF. So that's how you move them. You can open them up. If I want to collapse it, if I want to get rid of one of these notes, I hit the X over here. It says confirm removal. I say yes. I then save the record. And I can add this. Now at this point, I can Okay, sorry, I'm watching my clock. At this point, I could stop. Depending on the level of description that you're doing, if I'm processing a collection and it's maybe 2 feet, it's not very much, or it's very consistent in its content and I don't need a lot of hierarchy, I could simply create a top level record, assign some boxes to it, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. I want to do it actually when we get to the components, but we could assign boxes and folders and assign things to locations here, and you could just have the top level of record and stop, and that would be enough. But for most of us, we do want to go a little bit deeper, add some more hierarchy, add some more description. So at this point, let me spawn. So I've created one from scratch here, but I don't actually want to keep it. And I'm going to hit delete. It's this easy to delete something, which is honestly, remember back at the beginning, I said we had an intern repository so that oops can't happen. Well, depending on permissions, sometimes delete gets lumped in with some other permissions, and so they can do it. So to delete something, I hit the delete button. It's going to warn me. I said, do you really want to do that? Because you can't undo it. And I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, delete it. And it's now gone. And you can't get it back. So delete will warn you, but it's serious. And it's not here anymore. So let me go back and spawn something. I'm going to go back and find in my accession record, I'm going to go to my trustee minutes. And I can view it or edit it. And I'm going to spawn this to a resource. Now, resources generally are being discussed on about page 45 of your workbook. But if you go to pages 50 and 51, you'll see all of the fields that get spawned over from an accession to a resource. Now, it looks like a lot. It's not actually a ton. It'll take over the title, the dates, the extent, the resource type, whether it's papers or records, the condition description. So the content description here will spawn over to a scope and content note. The condition description will spawn over to a physical description note. And any linked agents or subjects will spawn over. But that's about it. So if I'm in edit mode, you can see some of the other fields. So again, this one will spawn. Condition description will spawn. Disposition, inventory, provenance, retention rule, none of those spawn. So any data that's over here will not go over to the, let me do resource type, this is records, disposition type transfer. I'm just going to save this so we can see if they go over or not. They won't go anywhere. They just live here. Now, it's perfectly fine to have them here if you need that information, but if you're putting information in some of these fields in the hope that it will eventually travel over to your resource, it won't. So you should just know that. Again, use the field if you need it, but know what goes where and what's going to transfer over, so you're not entering information that you later realize was a waste of time given what you were hoping to do with it. But if this is the only record you have for 10 years, fill in what you need. Make use of the fields that are there. So now we're going to actually spawn this over to a resource, which again, we're in the accession record, in edit or view, doesn't matter, and we're going to hit spawn resource. When we do this, it's now noticed by the breadcrumb, it's kicked me over into the resource module, and it's created a new resource. It's telling me this, it's been spawned, and you can see some of the things that have come over. It cleared out the identifier because it doesn't assume that the identifier should be the same thing as that accession. And in this case, I'm going to start a finding aid. So I'm actually going to change this. Actually, let me do one thing first. I'm going to add an identifier. And level of description I have to add. That's a collection. Could be record group. Let's call it that just for fun. I could decide to publish it. I might want to wait and to publish it to the public interface until this finding aid is a bit more fleshed out. That's a personal choice. I'm going to say that this is in English, the language of materials, these minutes. And actually, I want to change this a little bit because this is actually going to be the start of a larger finding aid, not just trustee minutes, but trustee records. It brought over some dates, so I don't have to add something in. Again, I may be editing this over time. Brought over the extents, and I may also be editing this over time as I add more things in. Finding aid data, I still need to add language of description and script before I can save the record. But what it also brought over was related accessions. It knew that it was being spawned from this particular accession, and so it filled that in for me. And these were those two notes that came over, if you remember. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So now I have the start of a finding aid. But I want to note a couple of things about spawning. So what we did was we created a second record. We created a resource record. Now, it's actually a standalone. It just took the data from the one record, populated the other, made a link between them, and that's it. They are now separate standalone records. If I edit the original accession record, those changes will not write to the resource record. If I edit the resource record, those changes will not automatically write back to the accession record. I can actually take an accession. Let's say I had an accession for J. Paul Getty's records, and it included his oil company records, his personal family records, and his art holding company records. I may want to actually take that accession and have 3 different finding aids related to what came into that. One for the oil company, one for the family papers, and one for his art holding companies. So I could take that accession and spawn it to 3 different resource records. That makes sense. And then tweak them as I go just to prevent a little data entry. Now, once I have spawned, however, one of these finding aids, I can't spawn something else into it. It's a standalone. So I could go back and let's say I want to incorporate into this record my trustee background files. If you remember, I have a couple of those. And I have 2 of them here, actually. And if I want to view it or edit, I can say that I also want to describe this accession in that resource. So I could go down on this side in the accession record and say add a related resource and say I want to associate this with that because they're all going to be tied together. Oops, I want trustee. University trustee records. And I want to save that. And I could, by the same token, go into resources, down to my trustee records, edit. It now shows me that I've got 2 related accessions. And this might be a bit tricky because the accession is the same, but I'm going to add one more. Still showing me both. I think it's the second one. And save that. So all of these things are going to end up being described in this resource, but I can't spawn any of the information, oops, there we are, from these other ones into this record. The spawning is a one-time only into the resource. So I can't spawn another accession into it. And unfortunately, that's the way it works. So it helps to some degree with preventing you from having to rekey some information in your resource. But because there can be a many-to-many relationship between resources and accessions, so one accession can spawn and can have multiple finding aids associated with it, and one resource can have multiple accessions associated with it. They don't, but there's only so much talking back and forth they can do because it would kind of confuse the issue. How would it do that? It would have to append information to a scope and content note, create a second one. How would the titles match? There are too many places of potential overlap if you're trying to spawn a second something into it. So that's how spawning works. And we've discussed notes a little bit, and we've started a finding aid. Are there any questions at this point?
There are a few questions in the chat. So the latest question was, can you spawn multiple sessions to one resource? So I think that you did just answer that, but if there are any more clarifying comments that need to be made, please drop those into the chat. And a few of these questions Brittany did answer in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and read them in case anyone is listening in. Can you save a draft while you find the asterisk or required information?
No, those asterisks have to be filled in before you can save the record at all.
Yeah, and Brittany makes a good point that you can always change the info later.
Yes.
Just to clarify, is the identifier typically the same number as the accession number?
It can be. It would depend on your repository practice. For our special collections department at the Getty, it frequently is, because there's frequently just a one-to-one relationship. That's slightly oversimplifying, but there's often a one-to-one relationship between the accession and the later finding aid. In my repository, which is University Archives, institutional records, we get the same, say, for example, from our communications department, we get a set of press releases every year. And so we don't start a new finding aid each year. We have one finding aid, and each of the press releases that we come in each year are described in it, but for administrative purposes, we track them. Each set has its own accession number for that year. So in that case, we have a finding aid number that has nothing to do with an accession record. I hope that makes sense.
It does, thank you. Can you clarify what other level is among levels of description?
I think that was something, it's in EAD. It comes literally from that. And I think it was meant to be some sort of hierarchical level that's, not otherwise accounted for. In-house, we sometimes use that underneath subseries when we have like a subset of records that we don't really want to do full subseries description for. It's like a subcategory of some kind. We'll use it for that on occasion. I don't know how commonly it is used in the community, the archival community, but it is determined by EAD. And so you can always go take a look at the EAD tag guidelines. And there might be, I don't know if there's off the top of my head, what the specific definition of that is, but there may be something in the tag guidelines that would tell you.
Yeah, and if anyone here is making use of the other level of description and wants to give that example in the chat, please feel free. There's a secondary question.
That space finding aid, some of our finding aids in there might show it in a few places, where it's just meant to be like a subcategory. That's how we've chosen to use it.
Okay. There's a secondary question here about when you're printing the PDF, it's not showing in bold. I'm thinking that maybe it's a question about like the tagged formatting and then print to PDF. We're not going to go into that in this workshop, but if you want to follow up in the chat, I can maybe help you there. Can you tell
printing PDF, there is an embedded style sheet. It's an XSL style sheet. It's embedded in the back end on the server. And so that's what governs how your PDF looks. So if your style sheet isn't coded to recognize that emfriend or bold tag and print it in a particular place, whether it's a title or within a note, even if you tag it here, the style sheet is not passing that instruction to the PDF. So some of your display might be based on how you're entering data, but a great deal of it in the PDF is dependent on that XSL style sheet.
All right. Thanks. Another question. Could you tell me how you created your EAD ID again?
In our case, we took, I think we had some kind of instruction. There was some guideline we found at one point. I can't remember where it is now. But we used like this US for United States : then we chose to use our mark identifier, our institutional mark identifier code to help distinguish it. And again, I can't remember how many colons we're supposed to put in. Getty's. And then if it were one of my real finding aids, it would be something like IA or something. But it could be whatever you want to call it. This is not necessarily prescriptive, but sometimes you do have to fill this in order to get good validation. I think this is a required field for EAD XML validation, but it's not actually a required field in ArchivesSpace. Personally, I'd make this a required field and not so much extent. But
to follow up on that, in the EAD ID field, we were only using our resource numbers. Should it have the US and ISO number?
I don't know that it has to. This was a choice that my repository made, or that the Getty made, to do it sort of this way. So again, this is where repository practice comes into play. I don't think there would be anything wrong with necessarily doing that. I think we made it a little bit longer to help make it more unique if we were sharing in consortial environments.
Okay, thank you. She says thank you. Going back to the other level comments, Brittany says that we use it for subseries. I think that's what she's referring to. And then the person who asked the question says, I don't recall it being in DAX, but thanks. That is how I have used other level to fit something in. And thanks about the style sheet. I'm just learning about it. Oh,
and if I misspoke, it's not in DAX, it's in the EAD. It's in the EAD tag guidelines. And so this is where it is in here in level of description. This is, and you can see it if you do the holdover, values are prescribed by the EAD schema. So the values that are in here are prescribed by EAD itself. And so you can probably find at least a list of them in the tag guidelines. Whether or not they're all specifically defined there, I'm not so sure.
Awesome, thanks. We are all caught up on questions, so feel free, I guess, to go ahead and keep going. Oh, we just said, oh, thanks. Someone typed thanks. But if there's any more questions, please feel free to keep typing them into the chat. And when we pause for another round of questions, I will read them aloud then. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to rip ahead into, remember we showed that Krispy Kreme finding aid earlier with all that hierarchy. So now this is our top level of a record, but let's show you how to enter more of that hierarchy at different levels. You could enter a straight box list underneath this. So if you just wanted to list all of your folder titles underneath this, you could, but I'm going to take the opportunity here to show you how to put in a little bit of structure and how you might do that. So let's say I have my Jane Doe University Board of Trustee records. And I've already associated multiple accessions with them. So I've got background files, I've got trustee minutes, maybe there's already other stuff. So now that this top level is saved, I'm going to go up here to add child. This is where I start to build out that hierarchy, is with add child. We're going to go back in a little bit and show you rapid data entry. So I'm going to add child. It automatically comes up as new archival object. That's just a component. It's not even, and you could at this point make it anything you want. It's not prescriptive about what level of hierarchy you're adding. You could be going straight to box folder inventory, or you could be building out series and subseries. It's just giving you the object, the option to build something. So my title here, let's say, for example, is going to be, and I'm not going to bother to correct my typing, I apologize. For an archival object, you see there's a gray here on title, and there's a gray asterisk, it's hard to see, here on dates. You have to have either a title or a date. I'm going to correct it after all because I hate that. you also have to have a level of description. So again, this is the intellectual part of the hierarchy that you're describing. I'm going to say this is a series, and I'm just going to call it meeting materials. I could add a date if I wanted to. I don't have to. And say 100 to 2000. And that's all I need to do. I'm going to save this. Except I forgot to add my inclusive dates. I'm going to save that. So I'm starting to build out series structure. Let's say I've already done enough work on this that I know I've got certain series. So I can at least start roughing that in. Now that I have this saved, you see another option. I can add a child or I can add a sibling. So I could add a child to meeting materials or I could add a sibling. Let's add a sibling. And I'm going to say this is correspondence. It's also a series. And this time I'm going to hit +1. And that will add another archival object at the same level as this one. So if I hit +1 here, it saves it as correspondence and it opens a new record. And I'm going to say and that's also a series. I'm just going to save that. So now I have a finding aid and I'm starting to rough out series. As I go back through, notice that there are all of these elements. A great deal of what you can do at the main level, not everything. It doesn't have the finding aid data section. It doesn't have, oh, what else? I think related accessions. But if I'm at this level, all, for example, of the 29 notes that are available at the main level are also available here. Because again, for a series description in my shop, we require a scope contents note. We require an arrangement statement. We might require a biographical historical note if that's appropriate, or restriction statements if appropriate. But they should all be available at every component level, all the way down to the item. If that's what you need to do. If you're describing Abraham Lincoln letters, you're probably going down to like that, describing individual letters. For some of these, you might be describing feet at a time, depending on the level of processing that's appropriate at your repository and for any particular collection. So let's build this out a little further. I've got meeting materials highlighted, and I'm going to add a child. And let's say I'm going to add minutes. And this is level of description is going to be a subseries. I'm just going to save that. And I'm going to add another sibling. And that might be working files. Maybe these are the background files for the Board of Trustee minutes. So, and this, notice where my cursor is here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little crosshatch bar. I can drag that so that I can see more of the hierarchy, and then the sidebar shows me more of this particular record. Now within minutes, let's start drilling down a little further. I'm going to add a child, and I'm going to say that it's, in this case, level of description, I'm going to say file. Because intellectually, I'm getting down to that level. And I'm going to say, in this case, I just want a added date. And I'm going to say, I could say it's single. I could normalize that. And in this case, I would do dash 12 dash 15. Normalize it if I wanted to do that. And if I hit save, so notice this is where I'm saying you can have either a title or a date. Because as I drill down, I am not repeating trustee records. I'm not repeating minutes. I'm trying to repeat what's kind of unique at that particular level. I could then add another sibling, and this one might be level of description file. dates. Oh, I keep clicking on that. I know better. Add date, and this might be where I won't normalize, but it would be the same sort of thing. The structure for normalizing, you can kind of see down here below. I'm going to save that. And I could keep going. So at this point, we're doing our intellectual description and hierarchy of this material. But we haven't actually started to say, so let's say you are talking to a researcher and they want to see the minutes from December 15th, 1988. We're going to start talking about physicality now. We're going to talk about instances and top containers. And everything that I'm about to say is one of the places where people in some of the basic trainings that we do in person get the most confused. But let me say up front that you know all of this. You're already doing it. What we're saying is we have this stuff that we are describing here. These are minutes from this Board of Trustees from December 15th, 1988. These minutes we're about to tell you how to put them in folders and boxes, and then those boxes are going to live on locations. And that's really all we're doing. But because there's a back-end database here, we have to structure that data in a particular way. And because something like that scenario, we have some physical material in a folder, in a box, on a shelf, is one of the, it's a very common scenario, but it's not the only scenario. So some of the language that we're going to be using that ArchivesSpace uses isn't language that you've commonly applied to this before. But let me assure you, you know exactly what we're talking about. You just haven't used this language before. So let's go back and let's say, here's my minutes. And I want to tell somebody what box, what container they want to pull to bring to the reading room for somebody to use it so they can actually use it. So at this point, we're going to drop down here. Actually, let me pull this to instances. I'm going to click on that. And it's here at the bottom, add container instance, add digital object. What's the difference? So for an instance, the container instance, and I'm going to explain this in a way, I'm trying to cut through some jargon here. So if I sound very simplistic, I'm not trying to talk down to anybody, honest to God. I have found over the 4 or 5 years of teaching this stuff that this cuts through some of it. Basically for the container instance, if you can pick it up and throw it, not that I'm recommending that you do that, but if you can pick it up and throw it, you need a container instance. It's a physical thing. If for a digital object, if you need a mouse and a monitor to resolve it, if you need a URI, that's a digital object. So we're going to add a container instance because our minutes are physical things in this particular case that we're going to pick up and throw. When I add a container instance, this is what I see. So the type, these are from Mark. I'm just going to pick mixed materials. It's like these go into Mark leader fields. And I'm going to discuss top container. So these are, again, not sort of defined as box, folder, item. These are defined a little bit more broadly because it could be a flat file or with a item within it. It could be a microfilm reel with frames in it, something like that. So the language is a little generic and not just box folder because it's trying to accommodate a variety of practice and needs. Why is there an option for multiple top containers? I'll show you that in a second. But what we're going to do is basically, if you stop and think about it, if you have a finding it you're creating, say Word, have multiple folders in box 1. You may also have a spreadsheet or database on the side that says box 1 is sitting in this particular place in my stacks. Every time you create a new entry for something using box 1, you're not going to add a new entry to that database saying box 1 is in the stacks. You only need to talk about box 1 once and have that recorded so you know where this box is in the stacks, but you might use box 1 over and over again in a finding aid. And that's kind of what we're doing here. So I'm going to create, in this case, I'm going to say that my minutes from 1988 are in box 20. Now I know I don't have one in here to search for, but I'll show you how to do that in a second. So I'm going to create a new box. And I did that by using this drop down on top container and create. So I'm going to say this is a box. The indicator is going to be 20. I don't have locations built yet. We'll get to that in a little bit. And I'm going to save it. It's in box 20. It's also potentially in folders 6 to 8. I wanted to track the item or something, I could. I'm not going to in this case. So, but in this particular set of minutes, let's say I had some oversized things. So I can say that this stuff is in box 20, folders 6 through 8, but perhaps it's also oversized material. I'm just going to pick mixed materials again, and I'm going to create container type is a flat file, and this is flat file 12. So if I save this, I can say that material to do with this intellectual file of minutes is contained in 2 different top containers, box 20, folder 6 through 8, and flat file 12. So if I want to see the entirety of that material, I have to bring both of those things back. So now if I go to March 15th, let's say that March 15th, I'm going to make instances. I'm going to add top container, mixed materials. Now let's say this is also in box 20. Now because 20 already exists, I can start typing for it. The system knows that this box 20 is associated with this finding aid, because in the database in the back, this box 20 has a unique identifier that you can't see, and it associates it with this particular finding aid. So it knows that this box 20 is associated with this finding aid and not any other box 20. And once it exists, again, you're just reusing it. And then you can say, if they're a case of folders, I think last time it was 6 to 8, so this time it's going to be 9 through 12. And maybe there's no flat file, but maybe there's something else going on. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to come back up. So in this case, 1988, there was a box folder flat file 12. And let's say that, let's add something else here. So let's go back to December 15th, and let's say somewhere between this period, the university was microfilming everything that couldn't be tied down for vital records, disaster recovery purposes, whatever. They were microfilming things. So I want to go back down to the concept of instances again. So we have 2. And so what we might also have is the same minutes on microfilm. So we have the physical minutes, the actual wet stamp or wet signature version in box 20 and in flat file 12. But let's say we also have a microfilmed version of the same set of minutes. Now I could go back up and add another entry for December 15th, 1988 and point out the microfilm reel, because it's the same intellectual content. However, what I might want to do is come back down to my instances and add one more. So in this case, it might be, well, it's still mixed material for the type, because that's the Mark Leader stuff that comes out with it. And in this case, I might go to create, and it might be a reel, and it might be reel 24. And maybe these are frame, let's say 25 to 175. Does that make sense? It's still the same intellectual content. You've just got the wet signature in one place and a microfilm copy in another. So that's why you can have multiple top containers with multiple instances. Let's build it out again a little further. Let's go back to March 15th, and let's say with these minutes, we have not only a physical copy, but we were transferred a floppy disk that had a version of this content in WordPerfect 1.1, something like that, 8-inch floppy disk. So again, how would we describe this here? Our floppy disk is something we can pick up and throw. So I would add a container instance for my floppy disk. And in this case, I might browse because maybe I don't have so many floppy disks in my collection, and we are physically separating them and putting them in a shared box in some place with better climate control. So I might look, and in this case, there might be a box out there that is a top container like this one that's being shared across collections. So I'm going to go browse and look for, let me see, that's not it. Oh, I know how I did it. Or maybe not. Oh, no. I thought I built one earlier, but maybe not. One second, let me save this and go double check something. Oh, I know. I saved this without filling it in. I thought I had created earlier. Something under, oh, I know how to find it. One second. What I'm going to do is look for, sorry to make this confusing, perils of live demos, computer disk. If it's not here, then I know I need to recreate it. There it is. So earlier, they say this collection also had some floppy disks. So floppy disk box is a shared floppy disk box 4. And if I click on it, I can link it. And so that I can say that this computer disk that has it in my description and my notes might call out that there's a computer disk. I might say that it actually resides in this floppy disk box 4 that multiple collections use. If I had gone in and say, don't use forensic software or whatnot to pull that set of digital copy of the minutes off of the floppy disk, I would save that on a server and I would use the digital objects to link to it. So again, that's the difference, something you can pick up and throw. Not that I'm recommending it. You add a container instance. Things that, something like the content that you would pull off the floppy disk that lives on a server, you would use a digital object to link to that and provide a URL. So that's how you, and I know it's complicated, read through the manual on that. But again, this is, you know how to do this. This is where we're getting into the physicality. Let me show you a faster way of getting all of this in using rapid data entry. So once highlight to use rapid data entry, it's almost entering things more like a spreadsheet from within the system itself. So I'm going to add, once you click on whatever it is you want to add children to, because when you use rapid data entry, you are adding children to whatever is highlighted. The children will appear at the bottom of the list. So let me show you what's on here. I'm going to hit rapid data entry. And you come back with potentially up to 33 columns that you can enter. For the most part, I just want to enter something fairly straightforward. So if I click on this 33, I don't necessarily want to enter all of this. I don't want other level. Maybe I do want to publish them. I want a title. I don't want a unique identifier. Don't want language. That's only required at the top level of finding aid. You can add it wherever, but it's only required at the top. I want dates. And even though it's not marked here, some of these are required. So if you're going to use dates, make sure that you at least have these 3, because label is required, type is required, even if it doesn't indicate it here. So be careful of that. I'm not going to add an extent. I just want to enter simple folder titles and box numbers. I'm going to take these out. For instances, the type has to be there. We have to have a top container. And I want to add, I know I'm going to put folders and the folder numbers here. And I'm not going to add notes. once I finish with this, I could, if one particular component needs a note, I can always go back and add that later. But for the most part, I just want to get data in the system fast. So I'm going to take these out. And now you can see this has gotten a lot smaller. I can then save this as a template right here. And I can say just basic and save it. So if I come back tomorrow, I can pull up that template and keep going. Now the blue on the top of these means it's sticky. If I enter data here and then add another row, the data will populate the next row. Things that are not sticky won't. It's presuming that's going to change every time. So in this case, I'm going to say, and I'm going to say a lot of these little red error messages are going to pop up behind the screen. Ignore them for now because it's looking for required fields that aren't filled in yet. So all of these are intellectually going to be a file. Let's say I want to publish all of them. And these little bars here, once this is filled in, I can shrink them up. Because theoretically, I don't have to go back here again if I leave them sticky. The title, I actually don't want a title. I'm going to go back and take out the title because remember, we're entering minutes and I'm just going to enter dates. I don't need a title. So I'm going to take that out. So this is where my date expression is going to be. The date type is going to be probably single most of these times. The label is going to be creation. And again, I can shrink it over because once it's sticky, I just don't really even need to see it anymore. The instance type, I'm just going to call these all mixed materials. I think that's the archival designation. And top container, we're going to create as we go. Child type, I'm going to make sticky because they're going to be folders. Child indicator, I'm going to make not sticky because that folder number is going to change from time to time. And I'm going to double check that that third note is gone. There we go. So now I have this. And I'm not sure why it's upset about beginner end. It wants an expression or the other. It will start going away. The expression, if I click on it, I make it sticky or not. I'm making it non-sticky. And I'm going to add a date expression. So I noticed my minutes started with about 1900. So I'm going to start rapidly entering and I'm going to create a box. I did that by, if you look over here on the top container, I could search to find an existing box, or I could create a new one. So container type is box. This is going to be box number 1. Create and link to top container. Here's box 1, and this is going to be folders 1 and 2. Now watch what happens if I hit the plus to add another row. It's going to continue. Not sure why it did that. Let me make this a little bigger. You could also add, say, 5 more rows. I'm not sure why it's doing that. It didn't, when I did this yesterday, it didn't do it. Well, what's supposed to happen, let me click to get rid of some of these. I'm not sure, I don't think I accidentally got rid of anything that was supposed to be required. Level of description is there. Title wasn't. Date.
Nancy, can you try to save it and then try again?
Yeah, let me try that. So there, it added it. Let me try rapid data entry. And I'm going to apply an RDE template. So here's the one I saved before. Basic data entry template. Maybe it didn't like the fact that I got rid of 2 columns after the fact. That's entirely possible. But I think that's okay. So let me try again. File, publish. Don't actually want title. This can be a little buggy on occasion, apparently.
Yeah, Joan volunteers in the chat that RDE can be finicky.
Yeah.
It acts wonky.
It worked yesterday. Let me start over with reset. So here's 33. Let me try taking out language, I'm leaving date. I'm not going to normalize for these purposes. I'm not taking out extent.
Jenny makes a good point that level of description isn't appearing, but and it's not grayed out, like colored in, but it's still checked. If you go up to the top, it looks weird.
Yeah, it was, for some reason it wasn't showing publish, and that was strange.
Yeah.
So let me try this again. And this, save as template. Okay, so file, expression, label creation. I guess I took out publish, that's fine. I just want to get it to work. Folder, make that sticky. Indicators, that would be 4, 3, 6. And since we already created box 1, if I just type box 1, gives me the option to fill it in. I'm going to make that not sticky. Now let's try adding another row. Kind of, sort of. It's definitely being finicky today. In any event, if this works correctly, the idea is that you can enter things just as a spreadsheet, enter 20 at a time and save them, and they should. This worked even earlier this morning. I don't know what the deal on this one is. Let me get out of it. It works better than the demo demonstrated, but the idea should be that you can enter a bunch. They'll enter as a row, and then once they're in place, if you hit enable reorder mode, and you see these little dots over on the side and where my cursor becomes a bunch of arrows, you can drag things. If I grab it and drag it down, I can add it after. And so I can move things around if I end up getting them in an order I don't like or need to rearrange them. Notice that while I'm in reorder mode, you cannot actually edit things. You can only move things. Trying to reorder things while edit was open was causing performance problems a while back. So it's set up this way. You could also, if you have something highlighted, do move up a level, down, or down into something else. So there are some rearrangement options once these things are in. Because as I say, when you do rapid data entry, it drops it at the bottom of any existing list, and then you have to rearrange things a little bit. And I'm sorry I could not get that to work a little better. I'm not sure why right now, but I don't want to take more time with it because I do want to talk about locations. So do we have any immediate questions about components,
We do.
instances and top containers? Why am I not surprised?
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to all of them. All right, just to follow up a little bit with RD, we've got a couple comments. Joan volunteers as a caveat, I would say to try 2 or 3 rows in the beginning to make sure it works before you try 20 rows.
Yep.
That's definitely true, and I think we saw that today. And I
Don't
will
go to lunch. If you're in the middle of RDE, don't stop in the middle and go to lunch. Save it.
save it. And maybe, you know, if you're working 20 rows at a time, save it 20 rows at a time. Don't go 100 deep and then get devastated when it times out. Jenny says, we have found adding from spreadsheets much easier than RDE. I will say that, yeah, that load via spreadsheet that Nancy featured or highlighted before that we're not able to get into, once you get comfortable using that template, it is awesome. I highly recommend.
It's about to become part of core code.
That's why it's, yeah, exactly. It's about to be part of core code. Joan, I have trouble exiting reorder mode and getting back to editing. Does anyone else have this trouble? Joan, what version of ArchivesSpace are you using? If you can put that in the chat. Going back up to other questions. Someone asked in the chat about suppress functionality, what suppress is, and I'm just going to go ahead and read for everyone listening. I'm just going to read Brittany's answer. It's a good answer. A suppressed record remains in the database, but is hidden from most users and unavailable to most functions. The functionality can be used to restrict access to unfinished records or to records of confidential material. Once the record is suppressed, only authorized users will be able to find it in the system. Another question. So whenever you were creating the container instance for the microfilm for the type, you selected mixed material, Nancy. Why did you select that and not microform?
I should have picked microform. That was an oversight on my part. Let me go change it. I should have probably picked microform in that case.
We got her, you guys.
Yep.
Okay, so going back and selecting your top container, whenever you search, it won't show every box 20 in your container database, just the box 20 associated with that collection?
Yes. If you want to find a box 20, as I did with that shared floppy disk box, you can go out and browse for any other container in your repository to use as a shared box, because there are a lot of places that get little tiny accessions, and rather than putting them in an individual box, they might share a box. So you can go out and browse for another box, but if you're just doing the type ahead from within this finding aid, it's only going to pull up those top containers that it knows are specifically associated with that finding aid. It does know.
It does know. We have another question about accession records and resource records. Are you ready for that one?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, when you have multiple accessions associated with one resource, does it mean that the resource described all materials in those accessions in the one resource?
I have actually had practical occasions when it doesn't, where I've had a finding aid, an accession that got split into 2 resources. So in that sense, by definition, either one of those resources only describes part of it. That happened because when I came, for example, to the Getty, a bunch of things had been kind of smushed together that never belonged together and shouldn't have been described together. But I didn't know where the boundaries necessarily were. And so I had an accession that I needed to describe separately and sort of split apart. So it doesn't have to, but you would want to take very careful notes in your accession records, for example, about exactly what is described in what finding aid and resource.
Great. Thanks.
It's not an ideal situation. Ideally, you wouldn't have accessions that have to be split up that way, but it happens.
And ArchivesSpace can accommodate that. Christina asked a question about digital objects, and Christina, you say that you are coming tomorrow and that you're happy to wait until then. So in the instance of time, or I'm going to go ahead and say, let's hold off on the digital object question because I know that it will be answered tomorrow. So just give you something to come back for. Let's see. Brittany or Christina, am I missing any questions? And then Joan says she's using version 2.7, is having trouble with getting out of reorder mode. I know other people have had that issue, Joan. Nancy or anyone else, if you can speak to that, please do. Or Joan, if you want, you can always maybe post it to the listserv and get some feedback. But I do know, I have heard of that happening, which is why I asked what version you were on.
I can't speak to it too much. In-house, we're on, as I say, 2.5.1, I think, and we don't have trouble with it there. So it might be a newer, something with one of the newer releases.
All right.
Before I forget, let me just remark on one more thing. Let's say, for example, you can see here, I've got two things in box 20. If that were a mistake and one of these things were in box 19, and I'm pointing this out because we got burned with it early on. And honestly, if you get burned badly with it, you only ever get burned once and you never do it again. But just to point it out so people don't get burned. Let's say I needed to change one of these to be box 19. What we found we had some staff doing were going in and say this is box 20. They would go in and they would edit. You can view, if you just click on the blue, you can view the top container and then you can edit it. Because this is the overall box number, if I edit it for every place that it's being used. So if I have box 20 used throughout the finding aid and I say, oops, and this particular set of folders are actually in box 19, and I think I'm going to fix it by coming in and editing this to 19 and save it and go back, oops, let me go over here back to my resource. I just changed it for both of them. And if I already had an existing box 19 in the system, now I've got double the amount of stuff that looks like it's in box 19. So let me go back and change that. In this case, I can change it back to 20. That I don't have other things in here. And if I save it. So this is it. And that's a terrible thing to do if you're using a box that's scattered across, that's used in intellectual order, scattered across a 100-page finding aid. You don't ever make that mistake more than once by the time you put it all back together again. So how would you actually change this to box 19? You would come down, and in this case, you would simply remove the box and either browse to find your box 19, type ahead to box 19, or in this case, we don't have one, so I'm going to create 19. And then you don't do that. So that's the trick. If you make a mistake and you realize that you've assigned something in the wrong box, don't necessarily edit the box, remove the link to the box and add the link to the correct box. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, if you have any questions about what I just said or want me to repeat it, I'm happy to. Otherwise, Jessica, unless there are any questions, I will rapidly move on to locations.
We have a few questions, but they're not related to this. So why don't we just go ahead and move on to locations, and then we'll do like a last housekeeping Q&A at the end.
Okay.
Right.
So at this point, remember what I said earlier, we were going to start talking about physical stuff. So we have intellectual content that we put in boxes, and now we're going to say where those boxes live in stacks. So for example, if you can pick it up and throw it, it's a physical instance, and the location is the place where those physical containers are going to land in your stacks. So I'm going to show you how to build them. You can build them one by one. I'm going over here to create, to location. You can build single locations or batch locations. I'm very quickly going to build a single location. And I'm not going to have time to go through all of these elements, but I'm going to say, so this is in the, and I will say that when you are building locations, there were two tips. Sit down with all of your staff who are going to be working in these locations and come to some sort of consensus on nomenclature before you start. What are you going to call each floor, each room, each area? And then you're ultimately, and as I show you in a minute with batch, build the repository wide as far as you can for all of your stacked locations at once. Don't necessarily build them on the fly unless it's a single one like this. That maybe somebody gets a new office, and so you have to create something. So while they're processing something, the materials are in this office. But for your actual stack locations, I'd build them all out at once. And then I would take away permissions to build more. For stack locations, I would have that be a consensus activity, and maybe only one person should be in there building them. Otherwise, you could have someone in there looking for column A, not understanding that your columns are all numbered 1 through 7. They think it doesn't exist. They start building out other locations, assigning boxes to them, and all of a sudden you've got a big mess. So I would have some internal administrative control over building locations. But to say that, so let's say this building is in the university library. It's on this floor 2, room 413. And let's say coordinate labels and indicators. Labels are a word. Think of labels as the label, it's the word of where something's going to be, and the indicator is going to be a letter or a number. So for example, let's say it's on a book truck in this particular room in somebody's office, and it could be on the first shelf. So maybe it's on book truck number 1 in this area. I could then say it's actually, if I were really crazy, I want to say it's on shelf number 2 of that book truck. And so I could save that location just as a single one. So if I've got something that I'm pulling, it's on a cart, it's about to go down to digitization, so I could even call it, I could edit it, I could call it so if somebody's trying to find it in the meantime, that's where it is. I could, if I wanted to, if I were doing actually more with space management, I could build in a location profile to say how big this particular shelf is. I could associate it with a repository. I'm not going to do that right now. What I want to do is, and I hope this makes sense. So I said a building, floor, it's in this particular room, and I've got it on a book truck and a shelf. So this is building out the 1 by 1 is good for some of these more random locations. However, it would be incredibly time consuming if I were going to try and build out my compact shelving this way. So that's why there is a location, create batch locations for things specifically like that. I'm going to go to batch locations. And so there's the top part looks the same, and then we come to a little table, which I will explain. And I will freely admit that the word range is used far too often in the spreadsheet, but little spreadsheet entry thing, but we'll work around that. So I'm going to say build again, university library floor G1 room. I won't even bother with it. Well, maybe I'll bother with the room. It'll be 4111. And then coordinate ranges. So let's say this is a room in which you have a bunch of compact shelving. And now we're going to build out that compact shelving. And this is hierarchical. So this range 1, 2, 3 should be becoming more specific as you go down. Here's the label we saw before, the word, and here are going to be the indicators. Now there are different ways of building this out. So for example, if let's say you're standing in front of your compact shelving and you have the element that has the little wheelie thing on it that you use to move it around. So that element, some people would say there are 2 ranges on that. It comes up one side and you've got, say, 7 columns, and it goes down the other side and you've got 7 columns. Some people could say that whole unit is one stack, and it might have 14 columns going around the corner. Other people might open up 2 ranges and stand in the middle, and so they might say it's an aisle. And on one side of the aisle, you have columns 1 through 7, so it might be aisle, and it might be aisle 10, side A, and it has columns 1 through 7. The other side might be aisle 10, columns range B, and have columns 1 through 10. So we haven't yet, in the 6 years I've been training, found a scenario that we couldn't cover using this. So let me try. So I'm going to say that for each block of compact shelving, each side is going to be I'm just going to call it a stack, rather than reuse the word range because there's already too much of that. So it could be stack. And let's say I have stacks 1 through 15. So if I'm looking down, I've got each side of a range of compact shelving is going to be a stack. And on each stack, I've got columns. And that column is going to be 1 through, or it might be A through G, column A through G. And then I might have shelves. It might be shelf 1 through 7. So the idea would be, for example, you might have stack 1, columns A through G, and on column A, you might have shelf 1 through 7. So you can see this if you preview locations. So here it is, stack 1, column A, shelf 1, and 1 through 7. Stack 1, column B, shelf 1. And I could potentially create 735 at one time. The maximum that you can create at one time is 1,000. So watch that. You can hit continue. And this is a good way to preview to make sure that you've spelled everything correctly, because while it's easy to create 735, it's kind of hard to edit them. So you want to make sure these are as accurate as you can get them before you create them. Continue does not create them. It just says, okay, I've reviewed these. So let's say I want to change it. Let's say that I'm one of the people who wants to use an aisle with an A and a B. So I could say aisle. I could say the prefix is A, and I have to build out each time. It could be a suffix as well. And it's going to be 1 through 15. I'm going to go A through F, 1 through 6. And then if I previewed aisle A1, if I decided that I didn't want it as a prefix, I could do it as a suffix. Preview locations, aisle 1A, column A, shelf 1. And then if I really liked these, I could, and I'm going to go 10. If I like this, I could go back in and I have to build column like the other side of the aisle, 1 through 10, B, A through F, 1 through 6. So I would do this in stages and gradually build out all of my shelf locations. I'm going to go ahead and create them. And over on the side, you can actually see all of the locations that are potentially in use by this repository. And you can drill down to them. So here's the G1 that I just made. And you can search for them. And this is University Library. And I've just created these. Each of these are blue. I can sort and resort based on them to find something. Another way of creating locations for another sort of purpose would be, I'm just going to do, and then I'm going to say I have a flat file. I'm going to say drawer. I'm going to say actually stack. And I'm going to say, and this would be, might be where I house flat files, and it might be stack 1 through 6. And it might be drawer, each say stack of flat files has 15 drawers. And I could assign then flat files to particular drawers. Preview, continue, create locations. Now I have these built, so you can either go back into your resource. I'm going to show you this very quickly because I'm right up against time. Edit. I'm going to go down to my meeting materials and my minutes, and I'm going to pick May. So I can assign them. If I come to top container, go to view, go to edit, and I'm sorry I'm doing this so fast. I can then add a location here, and I can type ahead and stack one. There we go. And I can like pick a particular column, or I can want to do 3A, shelf 5, and assign it. The other way to actually assign these far more rapidly, and I recall earlier, I'm going to go back here and save this. You will note that you will not see in the instance here, you will not see the location. I should note that the locations are not part of EAD. So those locations will not show up in your finding aid. They will not show up in your XML. This is something that ties this box to this location within the system, but it's not a part of EAD XML. So it will not export. You'll need to track that. If you need to track locations, you'll need to track it in the system. This manage top containers, again, I'm over here on this gearbox, manage top containers, and you can pull up a resource. So let's say I'm going to pull up my trustees by search. It will show me all of the containers that I'm using in this particular finding aid. I can sort them by indicator. I can click on multiple, say boxes 19 and 20. I can come over here to bulk operations. I want to send them to a single location. I'm going to say item, I want them to go here. Update to records. Continue. And this will take it a minute to do. And notice here's my floppy disk 4, which recognizes that it's being used in 2 different collections. Or in 3, there'd be a list of 3. So this is showing you it's associating it with both, and it understands that. If I hit search again, while this information is still here, eventually this will update. And so I can batch assign boxes to locations, which is a lot faster than going in through an accession or a resource record. So I am now about a minute over time, and I apologize for that. And that was really fast on locations, and I apologize for that too. I think I hit the bulk of it, even if it was a little bit too fast. But do people have questions?
Yes, there are a few questions. I'll go ahead and say, if we don't answer your question or you think of a question later on tonight and you're not able to come back tomorrow, if you are from an ArchivesSpace member institution, please sign up for the ArchivesSpace user group listserv if you have not already, and please sign up for the Help Center. There's a lot more documentation on the Help Center to help you implement ArchivesSpace, or even if there's something that you've forgotten, you can always just look it up in the Help Center. If you are not a member of an ArchivesSpace member institution, but still want to keep the conversation going, there is an open ArchivesSpace Google group. Just Google ArchivesSpace Google group, and you can post your topic there. It's super active, lots of helpful resources. And then, of course, there's tons of other documentation all over the internet. Please refer to the workbook that you got, as well as the Getting Started guide that was included in the packet, because I know we are going to skip over so much stuff today. But we did get a couple questions about locations, and I'm going to move back up. Can you add shelf barcodes here?
You should be, you certainly could in locations. There's not really, this top container really manages the containers. To add barcodes, I think you would have to do that. You can add them, I think you would have to do them at the time of creation. If I were to browse for locations, I can edit. If I grab a few, I can edit that batch. But I can't add, I can't change I can only change that top level information. So if I mistype a floor number or something, I can fix that. If I were to create, yeah, you have to do it on create. And I don't think you can using the batch.
You can assign barcodes to locations individually where you create, but you can't do it in batch. If you want to assign barcodes to a top container, like to a box, it's possible to do that individually or in batch. If you want to assign in batch for locations for like a shelf barcode, it would be possible, but you could do it via the API, which we are not even going to get into right now. But yeah, if you wanted to assign it through the interface, you would have to do it there. Yeah, it's a single.
Here's a single location, and here you could add the barcode, but there's not really in a field. There isn't a way to do it through the batch. Just as Jessica said.
Yeah. Can you explain to the temporary option in the location record?
I think the idea is that this should be. Let me go back to location. I think the idea is that, and I have never, honestly, this has also been a place that I've found to be a little bit twitchy over the years that I haven't quite been able to get to work quite right, is that if you mark it when you're creating it as a temporary location, that it might be, for example, like a reading room. So it's coming off the shelf, so you're building a location that is specifically for your reading room so that you could take a box and take it from the stacks and assign it to your reading room location, and you would mark the reading room as a temporary location so that it's not a permanent storage permanent storage area.
Yeah. Well, if once you click temporary, like indicate it is temporary, you'll get some options in the drop down. Exactly like she said, if it was going to your reading room, or maybe you were sending out on loan, or it was going out for conservation, people have used it when they're in the middle of a big move. So there are a few different uses for it.
But here's what it would look like. But you have to set it on creation of a location, and it doesn't look like batch let you do that. But temporary, so this is what you might say is reading room, and you might say where your reading room is, and then you could assign it. Yep.
Let's see. Okay, I think that's everything related to locations. We had a question about will we discuss formatting in the notes field and how to preview and previewing and publishing tomorrow. I think that we can definitely work that in. If you're interested specifically in how to format your notes, again, there's some documentation on that in the Help Center. I don't think we're going to go too in depth on that, but we definitely can look at like how to look at it, a published record tomorrow. Brittany says, I can definitely show publishing digital objects tomorrow. And once you know how to publish something in ArchivesSpace, you know how to publish everything. Is adding locations in the workbook, that bit went a bit too fast. It did go very fast. Yeah, so locations is definitely in the workbook.
It's in the workbook, and it's on page 66.